Get away from her! The words ripped through the frozen December air before Rick Thompson's Rolls-Royce even stopped moving. Snow swirled like static across the mansion's front steps, and there, huddled on the ice-crusted marble, was his mother. And a stranger. Rick's $15,000 suit meant nothing in that moment. The heated leather seats, the empire he'd built, the security system that cost more than most people's homes, all of it crumbled as he saw Margaret Thompson, the woman who'd once run a Fortune 500 company with an iron will, now trembling against a homeless black teenager in a torn hoodie. The boy's lips were blue. His hands shook violently. But he hadn't moved. Rick charged up the steps, fists clenched, ready to destroy whoever had touched his mother. Then Margaret's voice, thin as paper but certain as stone, stopped him cold. "He's keeping me warm, Ricky." Rick's breath caught. The boy wasn't attacking her. He was wrapped around her like a human shield, his own threadbare blanket tucked carefully around her shoulders while he froze. Blood stained the kid's torn sleeve. His bare feet were going numb on the ice. And Rick realized with crushing clarity, a homeless boy had done more for his mother in 1 hour than Rick had done in years. If you're ready to hear the whole story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because tomorrow, I will be giving you another story just as crazy as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now, let's get into it. Rick's polished Oxford shoes hit the marble steps with violent purpose. Each stride closing the distance between him and the boy felt like justice delayed. His security detail scrambled from the second vehicle, but Rick was already there, towering over the huddled figures. "I said get off her!" His voice cracked through the night like breaking ice. The teenager flinched, but didn't release Margaret. Up close, Rick could see the kid was barely conscious, eyes glassy, breath coming in shallow gasps that clouded white in the frigid air. The blanket around Margaret's shoulders was threadbare, more holes than fabric, and Rick realized with a jolt that it was the only thing between them and hypothermia. "Mom, I'm here. You're safe now." Rick reached for her, and that's when Margaret's hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping his wrist. "Don't." Her voice was a whisper, but firm. The Alzheimer's had stolen so much from her, but in this moment, her eyes were completely lucid. "He gave me his warmth, Ricky, when everyone else left me in the cold." The words hit like a sledgehammer. Rick's gaze snapped to the boy, really looked at him this time. The kid couldn't have been more than 17, skinny frame swimming in a hoodie that had probably been gray once but was now stained with grime and something darker. His jeans were shredded at the knees, not from fashion, but from wear. No jacket, no shoes, just socks that had more holes than threads. And blood. Fresh blood seeping through the sleeve of his hoodie, dripping slowly onto the white marble steps. "Jesus Christ," Rick breathed. The boy's eyes met his, dark brown, exhausted, but defiant. "She was confused," he managed through chattering teeth. "Kept asking for someone named Richard. I couldn't just leave her." Rick's security chief, Martinez, appeared at his elbow. "Sir, should we call the police? Check if he—" "Call my doctor, now!" Rick's voice left no room for argument. He stripped off his coat and wrapped it around the boy's shoulders before scooping Margaret into his arms. She weighed nothing, just fragile bird bones and thin nightgown. "Mom, when did you get outside?" Rick's throat tightened as he felt how cold she was. Her skin was ice. "I wanted to see the garden," Margaret murmured against his chest, already drifting. "The roses. Your father planted them." His father had been dead for 15 years. The Roses had died a decade ago. Rick turned to Martinez, his voice dropping to something dangerous. Find out which staff member was supposed to be watching her tonight. I want names. I want to know how my mother ended up outside in a goddamn blizzard. Yes, sir. And bring the kid, Rick added, already moving toward the mansion's entrance. Carefully. Sir, we don't know anything about him. He could be... He's half frozen and bleeding on my doorstep. Rick's jaw set hard. He chose to save my mother instead of saving himself. Bring him inside. Martinez hesitated only a second before gesturing to two other guards. They approached the boy gently, but he tried to stand on his own, swaying like a tree in wind. His legs buckled immediately. The guards caught him before he hit the marble. As they carried him toward the light and warmth of the mansion, Rick caught a glimpse of the boy's face. Not relief, not gratitude, just pure animal fear. The look of someone who'd learned that help always came with a price. Rick held his mother tighter and pushed through the doors. Inside, the contrast was obscene. Crystal chandeliers blazed overhead. Persian rugs muffled their footsteps. The thermostat read 72 degrees, comfortable and controlled, while outside, two people had nearly died. The night nurse, Patricia, appeared in the foyer, eyes wide with panic. Mr. Thompson, I was just checking on her room and she was... Save it. Rick's voice could have cut glass. You're fired. Get out. Patricia's face went white. But sir, I only left for... My mother almost froze to death 10 feet from this door while you were doing God knows what. Rick's control was fraying, the fury beneath finally breaking through. You have 1 hour to clear out your belongings. If you're still here after that, I'll have you arrested for criminal negligence. She opened her mouth to protest, saw his expression, and fled. Rick carried Margaret up the grand staircase toward her suite, the guards following with the boy. Behind them, melting snow left dark trails across the pristine marble floor, evidence of the catastrophe that money and security systems and hired help had completely failed to prevent. A homeless kid in torn jeans had done better. The shame of it burned hotter than rage. Dr. Patel arrived within 20 minutes, black medical bag in hand, her expression shifting from professional calm to alarm the moment she saw Margaret's blue-tinged fingernails. How long was she outside? I don't know. The admission tasted like ash in Rick's mouth. At least an hour, maybe more. Dr. Patel worked quickly, checking vitals, wrapping heated blankets around Margaret's frail body, starting an IV. Rick stood at the foot of his mother's bed, watching the woman who'd taught him to read balance sheets before he could ride a bike, now lying helpless, her breathing shallow and irregular. She'll recover, Dr. Patel said finally. But Rick, this can't happen again. With her condition, it won't. His voice was steel. I promise you, it won't. When Dr. Patel left Margaret's room, she found the boy in the hallway. He'd been placed on an antique settee worth more than most cars, but he wasn't sitting on it. He was sitting on the floor beside it, back pressed against the silk-covered wood, arms wrapped around his knees. The contrast was jarring, the boy's torn hoodie and filthy socks against hand-carved mahogany and oil paintings that had been in Rick's family for generations. Let me look at you, Dr. Patel said gently, crouching to his level. The boy flinched. I'm fine. You're bleeding and hypothermic. You're not fine. She opened her bag. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help. He let her examine him, though every muscle in his body stayed coiled tight, ready to run. The cut on his arm wasn't deep. Something sharp. Maybe metal. Probably from whatever shelter he'd been sleeping in before he found Margaret. Dr. Patel cleaned and bandaged it while Rick watched from the doorway. "You need rest and warmth," Dr. Patel told the boy. "And food. Real food." The boy didn't respond, just stared at the marble floor like he was memorizing the pattern. After Dr. Patel left with instructions and a stern warning about monitoring them both, Rick stood in the hallway, studying the kid who refused to look at him. "There's a guest room down the hall," Rick said. "You can sleep there tonight." "I should go." The boy's voice was quiet but firm. "It's 15 degrees outside." "I'll be fine." "You just spent an hour keeping my mother from dying of hypothermia." "You're not fine." Rick pulled out his wallet, extracted $500 bills and held them out. "Take this. Get a hotel room. Get some clothes, food, whatever you need." The boy's eyes flicked to the money, then away. He didn't move. "Take it," Rick insisted. "No." "Why not?" "Because then you'll think that's why I stayed with her." The boy's jaw tightened. "I didn't do it for money." Rick stared at him, the bills still extended between them like a bridge neither could cross. This kid, who clearly had nothing, was refusing more cash than he'd probably seen in months. "Then why did you do it?" The boy finally looked up, meeting Rick's eyes with something raw and honest. "Is the old lady okay?" The question landed like a punch. Not, "Can I leave now?" Not, "What do you want from me?" Just concern for a stranger who'd been confused and cold. Rick slowly lowered the money. "She's going to be fine. Because of you." The boy nodded once, relief flooding his features, and started to stand. His legs buckled immediately, and Rick caught him before he hit the floor. "Easy. You're not going anywhere tonight." Rick guided him toward the guest room, feeling the boy's resistance in every step. "I'm not trying to trap you. I'm trying to keep you from dying on my driveway after you saved my mother's life." "I don't belong here," the boy whispered. Rick looked around at the gold-framed mirrors, the vaulted ceilings, the chandelier that cost more than a year of college tuition. "Maybe not, but you're staying anyway." He led the boy into the guest suite, a room larger than most apartments, with a king bed dressed in Egyptian cotton and a bathroom with heated floors. The boy stopped in the doorway, staring like he'd entered another dimension. "I can't," his voice broke. "I'll mess it up." "It's a room. Rooms can be cleaned." Rick gestured to the bathroom. "There's a shower, hot water, towels. My chef can bring up food. What do you eat?" "Anything." The word came out desperate and honest. Rick studied him. The kid was shaking again, though whether from cold or fear or exhaustion, he couldn't tell. "What's your name?" A long pause, then, barely audible, "Bernard. Bernard." Rick let the name settle. "I'm Rick. And Bernard, you can leave in the morning if you want, but tonight, you're staying. No strings, no money, just warmth and food and a place to sleep, okay?" Bernard looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, trusted too little, and finally, slowly, nodded. Bernard refused $500 because taking it would cheapen what he'd done. He'd rather freeze than let someone think his kindness had a price tag. Subscribe if you've ever met someone who reminded you what integrity actually looks like. If you've ever realized that the people with the least often give the most. If you've ever been humbled by someone you thought you were helping. This channel tells stories about the moment you realize your entire value system is backwards. When a kid sleeping on the floor, because he's too afraid to touch your furniture, teaches you more about dignity than a lifetime of luxury ever could. If you believe that character isn't built in comfort, but revealed in crisis. Subscribe. Because Rick could buy anything except what Bernard gave him for free. A mirror showing him exactly who he'd become. Someone so isolated by wealth that he'd forgotten how to recognize real humanity when it sat shivering in his hallway, asking nothing except if the old lady is okay. You saw what Rick almost missed. A boy who'd been beaten and abandoned by every system designed to protect him. And he still chose compassion over survival. Only those who think poverty strips people of dignity and principles will not subscribe. Rick didn't sleep. While Bernard showered and Margaret rested under Dr. Patel's care, he descended to the basement security room, his rage crystallizing into something cold and surgical. Martinez was already there, 4 monitors glowing in the darkness, timestamps running backward through the night. "Show me everything," Rick said. The footage began at 9:47 p.m. Patricia, the night nurse, sat in Margaret's sitting room, phone in hand, scrolling mindlessly. Margaret lay in bed, seemingly asleep. Normal. Unremarkable. At 10:23 p.m., Patricia's head began to nod. By 10:31, she was fully asleep, slumped in the chair, phone fallen to her lap. "Jesus Christ," Rick muttered. At 10:52 p.m., Margaret stirred, sat up, looked around with that confused expression Rick knew too well, the one that meant she thought she was somewhere else, somewhen else. She stood, wobbled slightly, then walked out of frame. Why didn't the door alarm go off? Rick's voice was dangerously quiet. Martinez switched cameras. The hallway. Margaret shuffling in her nightgown, bare feet on cold floors. She reached the door to the garden stairwell, a door that should have been locked, should have triggered an alarm the moment she touched it. The door opened easily. No alarm. No alert. Nothing. "The system shows it was manually disabled at 8:15 p.m., Martinez said, pulling up logs. By Patricia. She said the alarm was too sensitive and kept going off when she checked on your mother." Rick's hands curled into fists. "She disabled the safety system designed to keep my mother from wandering, so she wouldn't be bothered by false alarms." "Yes, sir." The camera switched to exterior. Margaret appeared on the steps, descending slowly, gripping the railing. Snow fell heavy now, coating her hair, her thin nightgown. She reached the bottom step and kept walking, heading toward the front gates. Rick watched his mother disappear into the storm and felt something crack inside his chest. At 11:34 p.m., a figure appeared on the sidewalk beyond the gates. Bernard, walking slowly, head down, hands shoved into his hoodie pockets. He looked exhausted, defeated, probably searching for somewhere warm to sleep. Then he stopped, lifted his head, saw Margaret. The camera caught it, the moment Bernard noticed her standing at the locked gates in nothing but a nightgown. Confused and shivering, trying to work the electronic lock with numb fingers. Bernard moved closer, cautious, said something. Margaret turned to him, and even through the grainy footage, Rick could see her posture. Lost, afraid, searching for something familiar. Bernard looked around, at the mansion, at the gates, at the storm. He tried the call box, pressed it repeatedly. No answer. Of course not. Patricia was asleep inside. Bernard stepped back, clearly weighing his options. He could walk away. Should walk away. This wasn't his problem. Instead, he took off his blanket, the only thing he had, and reached through the gate bars, wrapping it around Margaret's shoulders as best he could. Then he sat down. Right there on the frozen steps, outside the gates he couldn't pass through. positioning himself against the bars so Margaret could lean on him from the other side. Rick's throat tightened as he watched Bernard give up his only protection from the cold to keep a stranger warm. The timestamp read 11:41 p.m. Rick hadn't arrived until 1:16 a.m. An hour and 35 minutes. Bernard had sat in that storm, freezing, bleeding from whatever injury he'd sustained before, keeping Margaret alive. "Where's Patricia now?" Rick's voice could have frozen water. "I had her wait in the staff quarters. And the rest of the night staff? 3 others on duty. 1 in the kitchen, 2 monitoring security." "Who were monitoring security while my mother walked out of this house and no one noticed?" Rick turned, and Martinez actually stepped back from the fury in his eyes. The feed rotation was on automated cycle. "They were. I don't want excuses." Rick stood. "I want them all assembled in the main hall. Now." 10 minutes later, 4 people stood in the marble foyer where melted snow still stained the floor. Patricia, the nurse, David and Chen, the security monitors, and Marcus, the night kitchen staff. Rick didn't sit, didn't soften his stance. "My mother nearly died tonight." His voice echoed off vaulted ceilings. "Not from a break-in, not from a system failure, but from your collective negligence." Patricia started to speak. "Mr. Thompson, if I could just explain. You disabled a safety system because it inconvenienced you. While you slept, my mother wandered into a blizzard. A homeless teenager did more to protect her than the people I pay 6 figures to keep her safe." He looked at David and Chen. "You were supposed to be watching monitors." "Where were you?" Chen's face flushed. There was a game on. We thought." "You thought nothing." Rick's control finally snapped, his voice rising. "You sat there watching television while a 73-year-old woman with Alzheimer's froze on my front steps." The silence was deafening. "You're all terminated, effective immediately. You have 1 hour to collect your belongings and leave. If any of you attempt to claim wrongful termination, my lawyers will bury you in litigation. If you speak to the press, I will personally ensure you never work again." He paused. "Get out of my house." They left without argument, shame-faced and silent. Rick stood alone in the foyer, staring at the security monitors Martinez had brought up. On one screen, Bernard slept in the guest room, still fully clothed on top of the covers, not trusting the luxury enough to get beneath them. On another, Margaret rested peacefully, warm and safe. Because a kid with nothing had cared more than people with everything. The house felt different with Bernard in it. Quieter, somehow, despite the new nursing staff Rick had hired, vetted this time, with backgrounds checked 3 times over and references that went back years. Bernard stayed in the guest room for 3 days, emerging only when the chef brought food or Dr. Patel came to check his vitals. He ate like someone who'd learned not to trust where the next meal would come from. Quickly, efficiently, saving half of everything in napkins he hid under the bed. Rick pretended not to notice. On the 4th morning, Rick stood in his home office reviewing contracts when he heard something unusual. Laughter. Soft and uncertain, but unmistakably laughter. He followed the sound to the library. Margaret sat in the leather reading chair by the window, morning light catching the silver in her hair. And beside her, cross-legged on the Persian rug, sat Bernard. He held one of Rick's childhood books, Where the Wild Things Are, and was reading aloud in a gentle voice that didn't match his worn appearance. And Max said, "Let the wild rumpus start." Bernard made his voice playful, acting out the monsters with his hands. Margaret clapped, delighted. "You always loved this part, Ricky, even when you were small." Rick froze in the doorway. Bernard glanced up, saw him there, and the kid's face went carefully neutral. "I can leave. I was just—" "No." The word came out rougher than Rick intended. He cleared his throat. "No, please. Continue." But Margaret had already turned to Rick, her expression shifting into something painful to witness. Confusion layered over recognition, like looking at someone through frosted glass. "Who are you?" she asked. "It's Rick, Mom. Your son." She studied him for a long moment, her brow furrowing. "Rick is at school. He has exams." She turned back to Bernard, patting his shoulder affectionately. "This is my Ricky. He came home early to visit." The words hit like a physical blow. Bernard looked stricken, started to correct her. "Ma'am, I'm not." "It's okay," Rick said quietly. He met Bernard's eyes across the room and saw the question there. Rick nodded once. "Let her have this." Bernard hesitated, then returned his attention to Margaret. "Do you want me to finish the story?" "Yes, please." Margaret settled back into her chair, content. "You have such a nice reading voice, sweetheart." Rick watched from the doorway as Bernard continued, his voice taking on different tones for each character. Margaret's hand rested on Bernard's shoulder, her fingers occasionally smoothing his hair, the way she used to do with Rick decades ago. The scene was wrong in every possible way. A homeless teenager pretending to be her son, while her actual son stood watching like a ghost in his own home. But Margaret's face held a peace Rick hadn't seen in months, and Bernard's gentleness as he turned each page spoke of a kindness that couldn't be taught. When the story ended, Margaret yawned. "I'm tired, Ricky." "Let me help you to your room," Bernard said, standing carefully. "You're such a good boy." Margaret took his arm, leaning on him the way she'd leaned on him in the snow. "Your father would be proud." Bernard glanced at Rick, uncertain, but Rick just nodded. He followed them down the hall, keeping his distance, as Bernard guided Margaret to her suite, with a patience that shamed every caregiver Rick had ever hired. At her door, Margaret paused. "Will you visit again tomorrow?" "If you want me to," Bernard said softly. "I always want you to visit." She cupped his face with one wrinkled hand. "You're my boy." Bernard's throat worked. "Yes, ma'am." After Margaret disappeared inside with her new nurse, Bernard stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door. His shoulders were tense, his hands shoved deep in the pockets of the clean clothes Rick had left in his room. "I'm sorry," Bernard said without turning. "I shouldn't have let her think." "You did exactly right." Rick's voice was thick. He moved to stand beside Bernard, both of them facing the door that separated them from the woman who'd forgotten one son and adopted another. She was happy. When's the last time I made her that happy? Bernard turned to look at him, and Rick saw tears the kid was trying to hide. "She's really sick, isn't she?" Bernard asked. "Alzheimer's, early onset. It's been getting worse for 2 years. That's why she was confused that night, in the snow." "Yes?" Rick swallowed hard. "She thought she was going to tend my father's roses. He died 15 years ago. The roses died a decade back." They stood in silence for a moment, two strangers bound by the same woman for completely different reasons. "I had a grandma," Bernard said finally, "before foster care. She used to get confused too, mix up names, forget where she was. But she never forgot how to love people." He looked at Margaret's door. "Your mom's like that. She might not remember your name, but she remembers what it feels like to have a son. The observation was so simple, so true, that Rick had to look away. "How long have you been in foster care?" Rick asked. Bernard's expression shuttered immediately. "A while." "Bernard." "I should go." Bernard started toward his room. "I've been here too long already. I don't want to be a problem." "You're not a problem." Rick followed him. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." Bernard stopped, his back to Rick. "Which poor? Because you saved my mother's life." "I sat with her for an hour. That's not—" "It's more than I did." The admission hurt. "It's more than anyone I employed did. You gave her warmth when you had none to spare. You gave her comfort when you needed it yourself. And just now, you gave her a version of her son that I—" Rick's voice cracked. "That I haven't been in years." Bernard turned slowly. His eyes were red-rimmed, exhausted. "I can't stay here, Mr. Thompson." "Rick! And why not?" "Because people like me don't get to stay in places like this." Bernard gestured at the hallway, the art, the chandelier overhead. "This isn't real. Tomorrow or next week, something's going to happen, and I'll be back out there. I know how this works." "What if it didn't have to work that way?" Bernard laughed, bitter and broken. "It always does." He walked away, and Rick let him go, understanding that some kinds of homelessness had nothing to do with having a roof overhead. Later that night, Rick passed Bernard's room and heard quiet sobbing through the door. He stood there for a long time, hand raised to knock, before finally walking away. Some wounds, he was learning, couldn't be fixed with money or good intentions. But maybe, if Bernard stayed long enough, they could start to heal. Rick found Bernard in the garden on the 6th day, sitting on the stone bench where Margaret's roses used to grow. The snow had melted into gray slush, and weak winter sunlight filtered through bare branches. Bernard wore one of the coats Rick had bought him, a simple black puffer that actually fit. But he still looked cold, hunched into himself like he was trying to disappear. "Mind if I sit?" Rick asked. Bernard shrugged, which Rick took as permission. They sat in silence for a while, watching birds pick at frozen ground. Rick noticed Bernard's sleeve had ridden up, exposing his wrist. There were marks there, purple-yellow bruises, in the distinct shape of fingers. "Those didn't come from the cold," Rick said quietly. Bernard immediately tugged his sleeve down. "It's nothing." "Bernard!" "I said it's nothing." The kid's voice had an edge now, defensive and sharp. Rick chose his next words carefully. "I've been looking into your situation, making calls. I want to help you, but I need to know what I'm dealing with." Bernard's jaw tightened. "You can't help me." "Let me try." "Why?" Bernard turned to face him, and the anger there was raw and real. "Why do you care? You don't know me. I'm nobody. Just some kid who happened to be in the right place at the right time. You saved my mother's life. So what? That means you owe me? That's why you're doing all this. The room, the clothes, the food." Bernard stood abruptly. "I don't want your charity, Mr. Thompson. I don't want to be your good deed so you can feel better about yourself. That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" Bernard's voice cracked. "Because in my experience, people don't just help. There's always a price. Always something they want." Rick stood slowly, keeping his distance. "What happened to you, Bernard?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Bernard's hands curled into fists, and for a moment Rick thought he'd walk away. But then something in the kid broke. some wall he'd been holding up for too long. "I ran away," Bernard said flatly. "From a group home in Newark. Been on the street for 3 weeks." "Why did you run?" Bernard laughed, harsh and brittle. "You really want to know?" "Yes." "Fine." Bernard pulled up his sleeve, revealing not just the finger-shaped bruises, but older marks, cigarette burns, faded scars, a mottled pattern of violence mapped across his skin. "This is why. The dad at the group home, Mr. Patterson, he liked to use us as punching bags when the social workers weren't around, especially the older kids, said we needed discipline." Rick's blood ran cold. "How long?" 8 months in that house. Before that, 2 other homes. One was okay, the other— Bernard pulled his sleeve back down, hiding the evidence. "Look, I know what you're thinking. You want to call the cops, report it, be a hero. Don't. It won't change anything." "The hell it won't." "Yes, it will." Bernard's voice rose. "You know what happens when someone reports abuse in the system? They investigate. Maybe, if you're lucky. Patterson gets a slap on the wrist, makes some promises. And the house stays open because there's nowhere else to put the kids. And me? I go back, or I go somewhere worse, and now everyone knows I'm a snitch." "You're not going back," Rick said firmly. Bernard stared at him. "You don't have a say in that. I'm making it my say. Mr. Thompson, Rick, and I mean it, Bernard, you're not going back to that house. Not to Patterson, not to the system, not to the streets. You can't just decide that. I'm a ward of the state. There are laws. Then I'll change the laws. I'll hire lawyers. I'll fight the system until it breaks." Rick stepped closer. "You saved my mother when everyone else failed her. The least I can do is keep you safe." Bernard's expression crumbled. "Were you so? Because someone should have done it a long time ago." The words broke something in Bernard. His shoulders shook, and tears he'd been holding back for God knows how long finally fell. He tried to turn away, ashamed of showing weakness, but Rick closed the distance and pulled the kid into an embrace. Bernard resisted for exactly 3 seconds before collapsing against him, sobbing like the child he still was underneath all the armor. "I can't go back there," Bernard gasped between breaths. "I can't. He'll kill me this time. I know he will." "You won't. I promise you won't." "You can't promise that. Watch me." Rick held him tighter. "I've built empires, Bernard. I've moved mountains for profit margins and shareholder value. For once in my miserable life, I'm going to use that power for something that actually matters." They stood there in the dead garden, among the ghosts of roses and the weight of failures both past and present. Bernard cried until he had nothing left, and Rick held him through it all, making silent promises to himself and to this broken kid that he'd move heaven and earth before he let anyone hurt him again. When Bernard finally pulled away, wiping his face with his sleeve, Rick saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not trust. Not yet, but maybe the beginning of hope. "What if they come for me?" Bernard asked quietly. "Then they'll have to go through me first." Bernard almost smiled at that. Almost. "You really think you can fight the system?" Rick thought about the security footage, the negligence, the way everyone he'd trusted had failed him. Thought about Margaret mistaking this kid for her son, and how Bernard had played along with more grace than Rick had ever shown her. "I know I can," Rick said. "The question is, will you let me?" Bernard looked at him for a long moment. Then, so quietly, Rick almost missed it. Okay. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't certainty. But it was enough. Come on, Rick said. Let's go inside. Your mother wants to read with you again. Bernard's face did something complicated at the phrase, your mother. But he didn't correct it. They walked back to the mansion together, side by side, as the winter sun dipped below the horizon and the lights of home beckoned them forward. Patricia Chen sat in her cramped studio apartment, scrolling through job listings on her phone. Each rejection email, a fresh wound. Fired without severance. Blacklisted from every agency she'd contacted. References that went dead silent the moment they heard Rick Thompson's name. 3 weeks of bills due, rent overdue. Her landlord threatening eviction. All because of one mistake. Her phone buzzed with another automated rejection, and something inside her snapped. She threw the phone across the room, watching it bounce off the wall and clatter to the floor. It wasn't fair. She'd worked for the Thompson family for 2 years. 2 years of night shifts and lonely vigils. One bad night, one accident, and Rick Thompson had destroyed her entire career without a second thought. And for what? Some homeless kid who'd wandered onto the property? Patricia retrieved her phone, thumb hovering over the screen. She thought about Rick's face when he'd fired her. The cold fury, the absolute certainty that he was right, and she was disposable. She thought about the boy she'd seen on her way out, the one Rick had brought inside like he was some kind of savior. She'd heard the staff talking before they'd all been terminated, how Rick was keeping the kid at the mansion, how he'd bought him clothes, how Dr. Patel was making regular visits. Meanwhile, Patricia couldn't afford her insulin this month. She opened her browser and searched. Newark Group Home Runaways. The results populated quickly. Faces of missing teens, police bulletins, social services alerts. She scrolled until she found what she was looking for. A grainy photo of a black teenager, approximately 16 years old, last seen 3 weeks ago. Bernard Williams. Missing from Patterson Group Home. If you have information regarding his whereabouts, please contact. Patricia stared at the number. Her finger hovered over it. This was wrong. She knew it was wrong, but Rick Thompson had taken everything from her without mercy. Why should she show him any? She pressed call. The phone rang twice before a man answered. Newark Police, Detective Morrison. Patricia's heart hammered. She could still hang up, could still walk away. Hello? Anyone there? Yes, I have information about a missing teen, Bernard Williams. There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. Go ahead. He's at the Thompson estate, in Alpine. The billionaire Rick Thompson has been hiding him there for over a week. The words came easier now, momentum carrying her forward. I worked there until recently. The boy is definitely the one from your bulletin. And you're certain of this? Completely. I saw him myself. Thompson brought him in during a snowstorm, has been keeping him there ever since. No authorities contacted. No reports filed. Another pause. Ma'am, can I get your name for the record? Patricia hesitated. I'd prefer to remain anonymous, but I'm telling you, that boy is there. Check it out if you don't believe me. We'll look into it. If you're willing to provide a formal statement. She hung up. Her hands were shaking. From anger or guilt or both, she couldn't tell. She'd just reported a child to the police to spite his protector. The realization sat in her stomach like lead. But Rick Thompson had fired her without a second chance, had destroyed her livelihood without appeal. Wasn't this just justice? Patricia poured herself 3 fingers of cheap vodka and tried to believe that. Across town, Detective Morrison hung up his phone and pulled up the case file for Bernard Williams, missing person case, flagged by social services. Patterson Group Home had been adamant about getting the boy back, though Morrison's instincts had pinged on that. Patterson was too eager, too insistent. Still, a runaway was a runaway. And if a civilian was harboring a minor without notifying authorities, that was a problem regardless of good intentions. He picked up his phone again, this time dialing a different number. "Patterson, it's Detective Morrison. We may have a lead on your missing kid." On the other end of the line, James Patterson smiled. He'd been waiting for this call since the day Bernard had disappeared. The monthly state check had stopped coming, and Patterson needed that money. Needed it badly. But more than that, he needed to teach Bernard Williams a lesson about what happened when you ran. "Where is he?" Patterson asked. "Some billionaire's house in Alpine. Guy named Thompson. We're going to go pick him up, but since you're his legal guardian, you should probably come along." "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Patterson hung up and reached for his coat. Then he reached for something else, the leather belt he kept hanging on the back of his closet door. The one with the heavy brass buckle. Bernard thought he could run, thought he could hide behind some rich man's walls. He'd learn different soon enough. At the Thompson estate, Bernard sat in the library with Margaret, reading Charlotte's Web while she dozed in her chair. The afternoon sun streamed through tall windows, warming the room, making everything feel safe and solid. Rick stood in the doorway, watching them, his phone pressed to his ear as his legal team droned on about guardianship paperwork and custody procedures. None of them knew that 3 vehicles were already en route. 2 police cruisers and a rusted Ford pickup that smelled like cigarettes and violence. None of them knew that the walls Rick had built to keep Bernard safe were about to be breached by something his money couldn't stop. The law, and the monster who hid behind it. Patricia Chen destroyed a child's safety because she was angry about losing her job. 1 phone call. That's all it took to send monsters to a boy's door. Subscribe if you've ever realized how easily one person's bitterness can destroy another person's hope. If you've ever been betrayed by someone who chose revenge over conscience. If you've ever watched systems designed to protect children actually hunt them down. This channel tells stories about the moment the cavalry arrives and turns out to be on the wrong side. When the law becomes the weapon. When doing the right thing officially means doing the cruelest thing possible. If you believe that justice and legality aren't always the same thing, subscribe. Because Bernard ran away from torture and found sanctuary, and the system's response was to send police cars and the man who burned him with cigarettes to drag him back. Because Patricia knew exactly what she was doing, and she did it anyway. You know that every child who runs away is running from something. That every act of rebellion might be an act of survival. Only those who believe protecting abusers is more important than protecting children will not subscribe. The gates buzzed at 4:47 p.m. Rick was in his office when Martinez appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "Sir, we have a situation. 2 police cruisers and an unmarked vehicle at the front gate. They're demanding entry." Rick's blood went cold. "What do they want?" "They're asking for Bernard Williams." The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Rick was already moving, taking the stairs 2 at a time toward the library where he'd left Bernard with Margaret. He found the boy standing at the window, face pressed against the glass, staring at the flashing lights beyond the gates. "They found me." Bernard's voice was hollow, dead. "I have to go." "You're not going anywhere. You don't understand. They'll arrest you for harboring me. They'll... Bernard turned, and the terror in his eyes was absolute. He's out there. I can feel it. Patterson's with them. Rick moved to the window. Through the ornate iron gates, he could see two uniformed officers, a woman in a gray pantsuit holding a clipboard, and a third man, late 40s, heavy-set, wearing a faded jacket and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. James Patterson looked like every mediocre man who'd ever held power over someone weaker. Unremarkable. Forgettable. Dangerous. The intercom crackled. "Mr. Thompson, this is Detective Morrison with Newark PD. We need to speak with you about Bernard Williams. Please open the gate." Rick pressed the button. "What's this about, Detective?" "We have a report that you're harboring a runaway minor. Bernard Williams is a ward of the state and needs to be returned to his legal guardian immediately." Bernard made a sound, half gasp, half sob. "I can't go back there. Rick, please. He'll kill me. He won't touch you." Rick kept his voice steady, but his mind was racing. He needed time. His lawyers were 30 minutes away at best. "Detective, Bernard is a guest in my home. He's not being held against his will." "Sir, he's a minor. He doesn't have the legal right to choose where he stays. Now, open this gate, or we'll get a warrant." Through the window, Rick saw Patterson lean toward one of the officers, saying something that made the cop nod. Patterson's eyes drifted up to the mansion, scanning windows like a predator tracking prey. Bernard saw it too. He stumbled backward, hitting the bookshelf. "I have to run. If I run, they'll chase me. They won't bother you. Bernard, you've been good to me, better than anyone. But this is my problem, not yours." Bernard was already moving toward the door, toward the back of the house. "There's a service exit near the kitchen. I can make it to the woods before—" Rick caught his arm. "Stop! Just stop! Let me go!" Bernard tried to wrench free, panic giving him strength. "You don't know what he does. You don't know what he's capable of." "Then tell me." Rick held firm. "Look at me. Tell me what he does." Bernard's composure shattered. "He'll beat me until I can't stand. He'll lock me in the basement for days. His voice broke. "Last time I talked back, he put out a cigarette on my arm and told the social worker I did it myself. They believed him. They always believe him." The intercom crackled again. "Mr. Thompson, we're not asking any more. Open the gate." Rick looked at Bernard, this kid who'd saved his mother, who'd shown more courage in one frozen night than Rick had shown in years. Then he looked back at the gates, at the men who wanted to drag him back to hell. "Go to your room," Rick said quietly. "Lock the door. Don't come out until I come get you. Rick, trust me, please." Bernard hesitated, then nodded and fled. Rick heard his footsteps pounding up the stairs, heard the distant slam of a door. Rick pressed the intercom. "I'm coming down. Give me 5 minutes." He didn't wait for a response. Instead, he called his head of security. "Martinez, I want every camera recording, every angle, every word. And get my lawyers on speakerphone. I want them hearing everything that happens." "Already done, sir." Rick straightened his tie, composed his expression, and walked out to face them. He moved through the house with measured steps, past Margaret's room where she slept peacefully, past the guest room where Bernard had cried himself to sleep that first night, past all the evidence of the fragile safety they'd built together. He reached the front door and stepped outside. The cold hit him immediately, but he didn't reach for a coat. He walked down the steps, the same steps where he'd found Bernard and Margaret, and approached the gates. Up close, Patterson was worse. His smile widened when he saw Rick, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Mr. Thompson, appreciate you cooperating. I haven't agreed to anything yet." Detective Morrison stepped forward, professional but firm. "Sir, Bernard Williams is a minor who ran away from state custody. Mr. Patterson here is his legal guardian. We need to return Bernard to his care." "His care?" Rick let the words hang. "Is that what you call it?" Patterson's smile tightened. "Now, Mr. Thompson, I understand Bernard may have told you some stories. He's a troubled kid, angry, likes to make accusations when he doesn't get his way. Funny, because he's shown nothing but kindness and maturity since he's been here." "That's the thing about these kids," Patterson said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "They can put on a good show when they want something. But trust me, Bernard needs structure, discipline, the kind of guidance only someone who knows him can provide." Rick saw it then, the threat beneath the concern. The promise of violence wrapped in social worker-approved language. "How long has Bernard been in your care?" Rick asked. 8 months. "And in those 8 months, how many times has he run away?" Patterson's jaw tightened. This was the first. "Interesting, because in my experience, happy kids don't risk hypothermia to escape their homes." "Mr. Thompson," the social worker interjected, her voice strained with bureaucratic patience. "I understand your concern, but this isn't a negotiation. Bernard is a ward of New Jersey, and Mr. Patterson has legal custody. You need to release him now, or you'll be charged with custodial interference." "Then charge me," Rick's voice was steel, "because that boy isn't leaving this property." The detective's hand moved to his belt. Not his gun, but the threat was clear. "Sir, don't make this difficult." "Difficult?" Rick looked at each of them in turn. "A 16-year-old kid nearly froze to death, keeping my mother alive. He's covered in scars and cigarette burns. He's terrified of going back." "And you want me to hand him over to the man who did that to him?" "Those are serious accusations," Patterson said, his voice hardening. "Accusations you can't prove. I have photographs, medical records from my private physician, documentation of every injury." "Self-inflicted," Patterson shot back. "The boy has problems. I've reported them to his caseworker multiple times." Rick looked at the social worker. "Have you ever inspected those injuries yourself?" She shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Patterson's reports have always been convenient," Rick finished. "Tell me, do you actually visit the home, check on the kids, or do you just file the paperwork and hope for the best?" Her silence was answer enough. The detective stepped forward. "Mr. Thompson, final warning. Bring Bernard Williams to this gate right now, or I'll call for backup, and we'll come in there and get him." Rick held his ground. Behind him, the mansion loomed, warm, safe, everything Bernard had never had. He thought about his mother calling Bernard Ricky, about the boy's gentle patience with her confusion, about the choice Bernard had made in the snow. "No," Rick said simply. Patterson's mask finally slipped. "Listen, you rich son of a bitch. There it is." Rick's voice cut through the cold. "There's the real you. The one Bernard runs from. You don't know anything about what that kid needs. I know he needs to not be beaten. That's a pretty low bar, and somehow you still can't clear it." The detective moved toward the gate call box. "That's it. I'm calling for backup and a warrant. Make the call." Rick pulled out his phone. "Because, while you do that, I'm calling every news outlet in New Jersey. Let's see how well this plays when CNN is parked outside your group home, detective." when reporters start asking why the system is so eager to return an abused kid to his abuser. Everyone froze. "You're bluffing," Patterson said, but his voice wavered. "Try me." Rick held up his phone, finger hovering over a contact. "I've built an empire on knowing how to leverage publicity. How long do you think your group home stays open once the world knows what happens there?" In the distance, Rick heard sirens. Backup was already coming, but so were his lawyers. And in the mansion behind him, Bernard Williams was safe for one more moment. That was all Rick needed. One more moment to figure out how to make it forever. The sirens grew louder. 3 more police cruisers appeared at the gates, along with a news van that had caught wind of something happening at the reclusive billionaire's estate. Rick saw the Channel 7 logo and felt a grim satisfaction. He hadn't called them yet, but he wouldn't need to now. Patterson saw the cameras too. His face went pale. "Detective, we should handle this quietly." "Too late for quiet," Rick said. His phone buzzed. His lead attorney, Catherine Moss, her voice sharp and efficient. "Rick, I'm 10 minutes out. Don't say anything else until I arrive." "Can't promise that." "Rick, just get here and bring everything we discussed." He ended the call. Detective Morrison approached the gate, warrant in hand. "Mr. Thompson, I have legal authority to enter this property and retrieve Bernard Williams. Step aside." "No, don't. You're obstructing justice. I'm protecting a child." Rick raised his voice, projecting toward the news camera that was already filming. "A child who was beaten, burned, and terrorized by the man standing behind you. A child the state is trying to return to his abuser because it's easier than admitting they failed him." The reporter, a young woman with sharp eyes, pushed closer with her microphone. "Mr. Thompson, can you elaborate on these allegations?" Patterson lunged toward the camera. "Turn that off! This is a private matter." "Is it?" Rick addressed the reporter directly. "The state of New Jersey places children in homes where they're abused. When those children escape, the state hunts them down and returns them to their abusers. That's not private. That's systematic negligence." "These are slanders," Patterson sputtered. "Lies from a disturbed teenager. Then explain the cigarette burns on his arms, the belt marks on his back, the bruises shaped like adult fingers." Rick's voice carried across the driveway. "Explain why a 16-year-old boy chose to freeze to death rather than stay in your care." The social worker finally spoke up, her face red. "Mr. Thompson, you're making serious allegations without evidence." "I have evidence. Medical documentation from a licensed physician. Photographs. The boy's own testimony." Rick turned back to the detective. "You want to arrest me? Go ahead. But do it on camera. Let the world watch you drag a traumatized kid back to the man who tortured him." Morrison hesitated. His hand was still on his belt, but his eyes flicked to the cameras, to Patterson, to the growing crowd of officers who looked increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. "The law is clear," Morrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Bernard Williams is a ward of the state, then the law is wrong." Rick stepped forward, gripping the iron gates. "And I'm willing to break it to keep that boy safe." A black Mercedes pulled up behind the police vehicles. Catherine Moss emerged, briefcase in hand, looking like justice personified in a tailored suit. She pushed through the crowd with the authority of someone who'd never been told no. "Detective Morrison," she said crisply, "I'm Catherine Moss, representing Mr. Thompson. Before you execute that warrant, you should know we're filing for emergency custody of Bernard Williams, citing credible threats to his safety. We're also filing formal abuse complaints against Mr. Patterson and negligence complaints against the state." "You can't just..." the social worker started. We can. We are. And unless you want every decision you've made regarding Bernard Williams examined in open court, I suggest you reconsider your approach. Catherine turned to Rick. Where's Bernard? Inside. Safe. Keep him there. She faced the detective. You execute that warrant, and we'll have an injunction filed within the hour. This will turn into a media circus that makes Ruby Ridge look like a parking dispute. Is that really what you want? Patterson's composure finally cracked completely. That kid is mine. The state pays me to take care of him, and I'll be damned if some rich asshole thinks he can just— There it is, Catherine said quietly, her phone already recording. Did everyone hear that? The state pays me, not I care about him, not I'm worried about him. You're worried about losing a paycheck. Patterson realized his mistake too late. The cameras had caught it all, his red face, his clenched fists, the rage of a man whose meal ticket was slipping away. Mr. Patterson, the social worker said weakly, perhaps you should wait in your vehicle. No, I'm not leaving without— You're leaving, now. Detective Morrison's hand moved to his cuffs. Before I arrest you for disturbing the peace. Patterson stared at him in disbelief. You're supposed to be helping me. I'm supposed to be protecting that kid. And right now, I'm not sure you're what he needs protecting from. Morrison turned to Rick. Mr. Thompson, we're going to need Bernard to make a formal statement, with his attorney present. Agreed. Name the time and place. And he's not leaving this property until we have temporary custody secured, Catherine added, non-negotiable. Morrison looked at the warrant in his hand, at the cameras, at Patterson, who was being escorted back to his truck by 2 officers. He looked at Rick, standing on the same steps where a homeless boy had once kept a confused old woman from freezing to death. 48 hours, Morrison said finally. That's how long you have to get your custody petition filed and heard. After that, if a judge doesn't grant it, I'm coming back with more than a warrant. Understood. The detective gestured to his officers. Pack it up. We're done here. As the vehicles began to pull away, Patterson leaned out his truck window, his face twisted with fury. You think your money makes you God? You think you can steal what's mine? Rick walked down the steps, right up to the gate, until he was close enough to see the broken blood vessels in Patterson's eyes, close enough to smell the cigarettes and cheap whiskey on his breath. Bernard was never yours, Rick said quietly. He's not property. He's not a paycheck. He's a human being who deserves better than you. And I'm going to make damn sure he gets it. Patterson spat on the ground. We'll see what the judge says. Yes, we will. The truck pulled away, leaving tire tracks in the slush. The news van lingered, the reporter already on her phone, no doubt calling her producer with the story of the year. Catherine touched Rick's arm. That was incredibly stupid. Probably. You've made an enemy of the foster system, the police, and God knows who else. Worth it. She almost smiled. Let's go inside. We have a lot of work to do if we're going to win this. Rick looked up at the mansion. In one of the second-floor windows, he could see Bernard's silhouette, watching. The boy's hand was pressed against the glass, and even from this distance, Rick could read the question in his posture. Rick nodded once. You're safe. I promise. Bernard stepped back from the window and disappeared. Rick followed Catherine inside, leaving the gates closed, the fortress secured. Outside, the world was already turning his stand into headlines. Inside, a frightened boy was learning that sometimes, just sometimes, someone fought for you. Not because they had to, because you were worth fighting for. Spring came to the Thompson estate like a promise kept. 3 months had passed since the siege at the gates. 3 months of courtrooms and depositions, of lawyers and social workers and judges who asked Bernard the same questions over and over until Rick wanted to scream. 3 months of Patterson's legal team painting Rick as a wealthy eccentric playing savior, of media scrutiny and think pieces debating whether billionaires should be allowed to adopt homeless teens like they were rescuing puppies. But the scars didn't lie. The medical records didn't lie. And when Bernard finally testified, voice shaking but clear, about what life in Patterson's house had been like, even the most skeptical judge couldn't ignore the truth. The Patterson group home was shut down pending investigation. 4 other children came forward with similar stories. Patterson himself was facing criminal charges. And on a Tuesday morning in late March, a judge signed the papers that made Bernard Williams a ward of Rick Thompson. Not adoption. Not yet. Bernard wasn't ready for that word, for that permanence. But guardianship was enough. It meant safety. It meant home. Now, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, Rick sat on the front steps of his mansion with the 2 people who'd somehow become his family in the strangest way possible. Margaret sat between them, a blanket across her lap, even though the evening was warm. She hummed softly, some song from her youth that Rick didn't recognize. Her hair had been freshly styled by her new nurse, a woman Rick had vetted so thoroughly he knew her childhood pet's name. Margaret looked peaceful, present in the way she rarely was anymore. Bernard sat on her other side, wearing jeans without holes and a hoodie that was actually his size. He'd put on weight. The hollow look had left his face, replaced by something that almost resembled teenage normalcy. He was reading to Margaret from The Secret Garden, his voice gentle and patient. Rick watched them and felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been broken for years, finally clicking back into place. The robin's eggs hatched, Bernard read. Mary counted them, all 4, tiny and perfect. I remember robins, Margaret said suddenly. They nested in the rose garden. Do we still have roses, Ricky? Bernard glanced at Rick, the question in his eyes. They'd had this conversation before. The roses were gone. But Margaret's memories weren't bound by what was real anymore. We're planting new ones, Rick said. Bernard and I. We started last week. It was true. They'd spent 3 Saturdays digging in the dirt where his father's roses had once grown, planting new bushes that would bloom in summer. Rick's hands had blistered. Bernard had laughed at him. It was the first time Rick had heard the kid really laugh, and the sound had been worth every blister. That's good, Margaret said, patting Bernard's hand. Your father would like that. She'd stopped correcting her about who Bernard was weeks ago. Some days she thought he was Rick. Some days she thought he was a young version of Rick's father. Some days she just knew he was someone who loved her. And that was enough. The sunset's beautiful tonight, Bernard said softly. Rick looked out at the sky, streaks of orange and purple painted across clouds, the kind of vista that his wealth had secured, but his arrogance had kept him from appreciating. How many sunsets had he missed, locked in his office, chasing the next deal? It is, Rick agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, the 3 of them on the same steps where this had all begun. Rick thought about that night, the snow, the terror, the moment he'd realized a stranger had saved his mother while his paid staff slept. He'd thought he was the hero of this story, the billionaire who swooped in to rescue the poor homeless boy, the man who'd fought the system and won. But sitting here, watching Bernard gently adjust Margaret's blanket, seeing the way his mother's face lit up when the boy spoke, Rick understood the truth. He hadn't saved Bernard. Bernard had saved them. Saved Margaret from the cold, yes. But more than that, he'd saved Rick from the empty fortress he'd built around his life, from the illusion that money and control equaled love, from the slow death of caring about nothing but the next acquisition, the next victory. Bernard had shown him what it meant to give warmth when you had none to spare, to choose compassion over survival, to be present for someone who couldn't remember your name but still felt your kindness. "What are you thinking about?" Bernard asked, catching Rick staring. "Nothing. Everything," Rick smiled. "Just glad you're here." Bernard's expression softened. He still had moments of fear, times when a loud noise would make him flinch, or when he'd wake up in the middle of the night thinking he was back in Patterson's basement. But those moments were getting farther apart. And when they came, he knew he wasn't alone. "Me too," Bernard said quietly. Margaret yawned, her head tilting toward Bernard's shoulder. "I'm tired, sweetheart." "Let's get you inside," Bernard said, standing and offering her his hand with a gentleness that still amazed Rick. They helped Margaret up the steps together, moving slowly, patiently. At the door, she paused and turned back to look at the garden, at the place where new roses were just beginning to take root. "It's going to be beautiful," she said, "when they bloom." "Yes, it is," Rick agreed. They went inside, into the warmth and light, leaving the door open behind them. The scent of dinner drifted from the kitchen, Bernard's favorite, because Rick had asked the chef to learn it. Laughter echoed from somewhere upstairs, probably Margaret's nurse putting on an old movie. It sounded like a home. Not a mansion, not a fortress. A home. Rick closed the door and followed his family inside, leaving behind the man he'd been, the one who'd measured worth in dollars and control. That man had found his mother freezing on his doorstep and realized too late what he'd lost. This man, the one Bernard and Margaret had somehow created from the ruins, knew better. He knew that the best things in life couldn't be bought or controlled. They could only be given, freely and without expectation. They could only be received with humility and grace. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, they came to you in the form of a homeless boy with a torn hoodie and a heart big enough to warm the coldest winter night. Rick looked at Bernard, helping Margaret settle into her chair, saw the boy's careful attention to making sure she was comfortable, and felt gratitude so profound it ached. "Thank you," Rick said quietly. Bernard looked up. "For what?" "For staying." Bernard smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. "Where else would I go?" "Home," Rick thought. "Your home." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, so was he. Rick thought he was saving Bernard. He was wrong. The homeless boy saved the billionaire. The throwaway kid saved the family. The one everyone else had given up on saved the man who had everything, except what mattered. Subscribe if you've ever been saved by someone you thought needed saving. If you've ever discovered that the person you pitied was actually the strongest one in the room. If you've ever realized that the greatest poverty isn't lacking money, it's lacking someone who sees you as worth fighting for. This channel exists because these stories matter. Not the fairy tale versions where rich people swoop in and fix everything with checkbooks. The real versions, where broken people save each other, where the person sleeping on your floor teaches you what home actually means. If you believe that family isn't about blood or paperwork, it's about who stays when staying is hard, subscribe. Because Bernard could have kept walking that night. He was cold, hungry, hurt, and desperate. Margaret wasn't his responsibility. He could have saved himself. But he stopped, wrapped his only blanket around a stranger, chose her life over his comfort. Subscribe, because somewhere right now, there's a kid like Bernard sleeping under a bridge. There's a mother like Margaret wandering confused into danger. There's a man like Rick who's built walls so high he can't see the people dying at his gates. And maybe, just maybe, one of them is you. Subscribe if you've ever been frozen by fear, by grief, by the crushing weight of a life that looks perfect but feels empty. And someone, somehow, gave you their warmth when they had none to spare. Because we're all just one snowstorm away from needing a Bernard, and one choice away from becoming one. Only those who believe that some people are disposable and unworthy of love will not subscribe.
Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.